Imagine building a civilization, right? Like one with the capacity for advanced ocean-faring vessels, complex chemistry, and intricate solar astronomy.
Yeah, a truly advanced setup.
Exactly. And then standing right at the precipice of the agricultural revolution and, the invention of mass farming and the inevitable warfare that usually follows and just saying, no thanks.
It completely defies our expectations.
Yes.
Because usually when we talk about a civilization's success, well, there's this underlying assumption of aggressive expansion.
Right, the whole empire building thing.
Precisely. You build a bigger wall, you conquer a neighboring city. The historical map shows that, that jagged red line of your empire pushing outward.
And historians point at that growth and
Yeah.
declare it this massive triumph of human achievement.
It is the defining metric we apply to the ancient world. We look for the accumulation of mass. More land, more wealth, more monumental architecture built on the backs of, well, thousands of laborers.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It is. We're culturally conditioned to look for a centralized power structure and view its physical footprint as the ultimate indicator of success.
But then you step into the world of ancient human history, specifically in the Japanese archipelago, and suddenly that whole imperial map-making machine just shatters.
It completely falls apart.
It really does. We're looking at a historical landscape that challenges the fundamental narrative of what it actually means to be a successful society. Because modern society, for you, for me, for all of us, often feels like it has hit a breaking point.
Oh, absolutely. The burnout is just everywhere.
Yeah, the mass burnout, the escalating environmental crises, the endless grinding hustle just to, maintain the status quo. We are desperately searching for a lifeline.
And the premise we're exploring today suggests that the ultimate blueprint for a sustainable, peaceful future isn't actually ahead of us in some, undiscovered technology.
Right, it's 13,000 years in the past.
Which is an incredibly provocative proposition, and yet it's precisely what is currently captivating top global intellectuals.
Yeah.
We're witnessing a massive paradigm shift in how anthropologists and historians view human progression.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the start.
Uh-huh.
Our sources for today's deep dive give us a really comprehensive lens into this shift.
You do. It's a great collection of materials.
Yeah, we're looking at a detailed presentation slide deck titled The Jomon Blueprint, a highly passionate YouTube blog transcript breaking down recent archaeological revelations, and a critical essay highlighting the perspectives of the legendary 20th century anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss.
A really fascinating mix of academic and accessible sources.
For sure. And our mission today is to explore how the Jomon people of ancient Japan achieved roughly 13,000 years of unbroken peace and sustainability. And most importantly, what you can learn from a society that made radically different choices.
To really grasp the scale of this, I want you to visualize the physical reality of our conversation today.
Okay, paint the picture.
So the visual backdrop for this deep dive is a lush, ancient, impossibly dense forest. But seamlessly interwoven through the roots and branches are these swirling, asymmetrical, highly intricate pottery designs.
Oh, wow.
That is the Jomon world. The period lasted roughly from 16,500 to 3,000 years ago.
That timeline is just staggering.
It is. An anomaly of that duration forces us to completely rewrite the timeline of human capability.
I am genuinely buzzing to get into this because for the longest time, the Jomon period was just written off.
Yeah, largely ignored or misunderstood.
Right. It was viewed as this primitive caveman era, just a bunch of hunter-gatherers scraping by in the mud, basically waiting for the quote-unquote real civilization of rice farming to arrive from the continent.
Exactly. The traditional narrative was very dismissive.
But suddenly, they're the center of a global renaissance. And the first major indicator of this shift happened at the British Museum in London.
Which is a monumental institution. The British Museum holds roughly 8 million items in its permanent collection.
8 million! That's hard to even picture.
Right, and it represents the entirety of human history across every continent. So they recently underwent a curatorial process to select a 10 must-sees list to represent the absolute pinnacle of their holdings.
And out of 8 million objects, they chose a 5,000-year-old Jomon pot.
They did.
It was placed right alongside the Rosetta Stone, the key that unlocked ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, and a colossal statue of Ramses II.
It's incredible company to keep.
Right. A piece of clay from ancient Japan sitting shoulder to shoulder with the absolute titans of human antiquity.
Placing the Jomon pot in that specific context is the global historical establishment formally acknowledging it as a masterwork of human achievement.
It's a huge deal.
It really is. And this institutional recognition was amplified significantly in 2021 when UNESCO made a highly unusual decision.
Oh, yeah, the World Heritage thing.
Yes, they registered 17 distinct Jomon archaeological sites across Hokkaido and northern Tohoku as World Heritage Sites.
Which feels totally counterintuitive when you look at how UNESCO usually operates. I mean, when you think of a World Heritage Site, you think of, like, the Pyramids of Giza, the Great Wall of China, Machu Picchu.
Right, the grand monuments.
Exactly. You think of giant, dominating stone structures that basically impose humanity's will onto the landscape.
What's fascinating here is analyzing the criteria for that recognition. UNESCO typically awards World Heritage status to massive monuments that represent the concentration of extreme power.
Like a pharaoh or an emperor.
Exactly. A pyramid is, at its core, a monument to a ruler's ego, built through the forced labor of thousands. It represents a highly stratified, unequal society.
But the Jomon didn't have any of that.
None of it. The Jomon sites have no pyramids, they have no grand palaces, there is no central throne room.
So what exactly were they recognizing?
UNESCO essentially registered an invisible spiritual culture. They honored the stone circles and the clay figures known as dogu, but primarily they elevated a 10,000-year testament to sustainable daily living.
That is just, it's essentially like giving the Academy Award for Best Picture, not to the billion-dollar blockbuster with CGI explosions and massive armies, but to, like, a subtle documentary about a perfectly functioning neighborhood where people just quietly take care of each other for millennia.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
It elevates the act of living in harmony over the act of conquest.
That framing captures the essence of the UNESCO decision perfectly. They awarded the unbroken continuation of a peaceful society. And the physical manifestation of that society, the pottery itself, is what drew the attention of Claude Lévi-Strauss.
Yes, the sources feature an essay on Lévi-Strauss, who studied cultures across the globe. He attended a Jomon exhibition in Paris in 1998, and apparently the experience completely floored him.
It changed his entire perspective.
He praised the pottery as a highly advanced original civilization of beauty, stating there is nothing comparable in human anthropology.
Lévi-Strauss was analyzing the geometry and the intent behind the creation. If you examine ancient pottery from almost any other region, Mesopotamia, ancient China, early Europe, you see a heavy reliance on rigid, symmetrical geometric patterns.
Like perfect circles and straight lines.
Exactly. The human hand trying to impose mathematical order on the clay. But Jomon pottery actively rebels against that. It features wild, asymmetrical, swirling, plant-like curves.
It almost looks alive, honestly, like flames reaching up from the rim or vines trying to pull the vase back into the earth. It doesn't even look like a container. It looks like a sculpture that happens to hold water.
Lévi-Strauss argued it rivals the most avant-garde modern art of the 20th century. Furthermore, he emphasized its absolute originality.
Meaning they didn't just copy it from someone else.
Right. This style was not imported or copied from a neighboring civilization. It was a localized, spontaneous creation born entirely from their specific animistic worldview.
He also drew a direct line from these ancient swirling pots to modern Japanese aesthetics, didn't he?
He did. He saw the ancestral roots of the modern Japanese dedication to craft, the Jomon approach.
Like the attention to detail.
Yes. The intense focus on taking time, the reverence for the imperfect or the asymmetrical, the blending of the functional with the natural. Lévi-Strauss viewed modern Japanese aesthetic philosophy not as a recent development, but as a direct inheritance from Jomon creativity.
Which forces me to ask, why is the modern intellectual world suddenly grasping onto this? Like, are we just experiencing an art history fad, or are we looking at a 5,000-year-old clay pot and realizing that these people figured out a survival mechanism that we have completely lost in our hyper-accelerated modern state?
The aesthetic appreciation is merely the entry point. The deeper obsession among historians stems from what the Jomon people actively refuse to do.
Okay, now we're getting into it.
Right. Their pottery is beautiful, but their societal choices challenge the foundational theories of human anthropology.
This brings us to a massively influential perspective featured in our sources, the work of anthropologist David Graeber and archaeologist David Wengrow, specifically their thesis in their book, The Dawn of Everything.
A really groundbreaking piece of work.
It really is. They challenge the accepted standard path of human civilization. We've all been taught this linear progression in school, this idea that human development follows a rigid biological inevitability.
The traditional academic consensus dictates a very specific sequence of events. You begin as egalitarian hunter-gatherers. Then someone invents pottery to store things.
Right.
This leads to the agricultural revolution. Humans figure out how to farm and settle in one place. Farming creates a surplus of food, which leads to the accumulation of wealth.
And as soon as you have wealth, you have people who want to protect it, which naturally leads to the creation of classes, inequality, and eventually kings or centralized states.
Exactly.
And then those states militarize to protect their surplus and inevitably expand to conquer more resources, leading to war, environmental degradation, and usually collapse.
That is the standard narrative. The underlying assumption has always been that inequality, hierarchy, and warfare are the automatic, unavoidable consequences of adopting agriculture and sedentary living.
Like, we're just wired to do it.
Right. The moment we learned to store grain, our fate was supposedly sealed.
Graeber and Wengrow's thesis, as our sources detail, uses the Jomon as the ultimate counter-evidence to this entire trajectory. And we should note, Graeber and Wengrow's thesis here is strictly anthropological.
Right, it's about the data.
Yeah, they aren't trying to map ancient Japan onto modern political or economic ideologies. Rather, they are using the archaeological data to challenge the assumption that human beings are biologically hardwired to hoard wealth and destroy their environment. The Jomon actively opted out of the cycle, and it wasn't because they were primitive or lacked the technology to expand.
Not at all. The technological capabilities of the region were staggering. The sources point out that 38,000 years ago, which is tens of thousands of years before the first stones of the pyramids were even cut, ancestors in the Japanese archipelago were making 50-kilometer open ocean voyages to an island called Kozushima, specifically to mine obsidian.
Okay, let's just pause and think about the mechanics of a 50-kilometer open ocean voyage during the Paleolithic era.
It's almost unimaginable.
You aren't just floating on a log, you are dealing with the Kuroshio current, which is incredibly powerful. You need a deep understanding of celestial navigation, buoyancy, woodworking, to hollow out a dugout canoe, waterproofing, and like the logistical coordination of a whole crew.
It requires advanced engineering and collective intent. And their technological prowess continued to evolve. They possess some of the oldest pottery in the world, dating back 16,500 years.
Wow.
They were creating highly sophisticated, toxic-resistant lacquerware 9,000 years ago. The archaeological record also contains rice phytoliths.
Wait, what are phytoliths again?
They are microscopic silica structures that remain in the soil long after the plant decays. So finding them proves definitively that the Jomon had access to and knowledge of rice.
So they had the boats to explore and conquer, they had the pottery to store massive wealth, they had the agricultural knowledge to grow fields of grain. They possessed every single ingredient required to trigger the standard path of empire building.
Yes.
And they just refused.
The implication of that refusal is profound. It demonstrates that the progression into extreme inequality and violent expansion was not an automatic biological inevitability.
It's a choice.
Exactly. It was a choice. The Jomon evaluated the standard path and deliberately opted for an alternative structure, maintaining that alternative for over 10 millennia.
I'm going to push back slightly here because the skeptic in me has to ask, did they consciously choose peace, or was the Japanese archipelago just an incredibly fertile Garden of Eden?
Ah, the passive abundance theory.
Yeah, like if you're living on an island so rich in natural food that you can basically walk outside and grab a fish or a handful of nuts, maybe you just don't feel the pressure to invent mass agriculture or go to war over resources.
It is a common critique, but the archaeological evidence heavily refutes it. Abundance doesn't prevent a society from adopting agriculture. In fact, early agriculture often emerged in highly fertile river valleys.
Oh, well, that makes sense.
The Jomon displayed active resistance. When large-scale agriculture, such as intense rice paddy cultivation, was introduced from the continent, they actively resisted adopting it as their primary economic engine for over a millennium.
They saw the new tech, understood how it worked, and recognized it would require clear-cutting their forests and reorganizing their labor, so they consciously rejected it.
They chose to integrate it merely as a supplement. They only grew what was strictly necessary to diversify their diet.
That is so deliberate.
It is. They understood, whether through observation or deeply ingrained cultural intuition, that a massive agricultural surplus would fundamentally alter their social fabric. It would create landowners and laborers. They prioritized the maintenance of their egalitarian social structure over the accumulation of caloric wealth.
Okay, but if they're completely rejecting mass farming, how does a society survive and thrive for 13,000 years in one localized region without entirely exhausting their environment?
It's the ultimate question.
Like, if I stay in the same apartment for too long, the surrounding resources start looking pretty sparse. Human beings consume. How did they not eat themselves into extinction?
This is where their survival strategy transitions into pure genius. They engineered what is arguably the ultimate circular economy.
Okay.
It required an incredibly diverse diet and a profoundly intimate understanding of their local biome.
The data in the slide deck is mind-blowing on this. We're talking about consuming over 70 distinct types of fish, 350 types of shellfish, 55 types of plants and nuts, alongside wild game like boar and deer.
That hyperdiversity is the key mechanism of their sustainability. If you rely entirely on one crop, like wheat or rice, a single drought or blight destroys your civilization.
Because all your eggs are in one basket.
Precisely. By spreading their caloric intake across hundreds of different species, they insulated themselves from ecological shocks. But it wasn't just about what they ate. Their entire society was governed by two strict philosophies regarding consumption.
Right. And the first philosophy is devastatingly simple: don't take too much.
And we know this wasn't just a romanticized oral tradition because the evidence is physically preserved in their shell mounds.
The ancient garbage dumps, basically.
Essentially, yes. Shell mounds are the refuse heaps of the ancient world. Researchers excavating these mounds discovered a fascinating pattern. The Jomon intentionally left small, immature shells behind.
They were actively sorting their catch and throwing the young ones back into the ocean.
They possessed a deep empirical understanding of the breeding cycles and population dynamics of the marine life they depended on. They knew that harvesting the juveniles would precipitate a population collapse.
That's some advanced conservation right there.
Truly. They operated strictly within the regenerative boundaries of the ecosystem. They never pushed the natural cycle to a breaking point for the sake of a temporary surplus.
And the second philosophy perfectly complements the first: use everything up. For the Jomon, the modern concept of trash was completely alien.
It was a rigorously circular mindset. The taking of a life, even an animal, came with an absolute obligation to utilize every single component.
You don't just take the meat.
Exactly. If they hunted a deer, the meat provided immediate calories, but the bones were meticulously carved into highly effective fishhooks. The antlers were fashioned into specialized tools for weaving or digging.
Wow.
And the tendons were dried, processed, and woven into the durable thread for clothing and structural lashing.
It is the ultimate expression of respect for the life you consume. You don't just take, you cycle it completely back into your daily existence. And this approach extended to how they managed the forests, too. The sources outline a practice called semi-cultivation, which completely flips our understanding of agriculture.
When a standard civilization practices agriculture, they draw a violent, definitive boundary between humanity and nature.
Right?
You take an axe to a forest, you burn the stumps, you plow the earth, and you declare, this is human space. Nature is excluded from this zone unless we specifically plant it. It's an act of domination.
But the Jomon completely blurred that boundary. Instead of destroying the forest to create a field, they worked directly within the existing wild ecosystem.
They identified the strongest, highest-yielding chestnut and walnut trees, and they gently propagated them within the natural forest canopy.
They just nudged nature in the right direction.
Yes. They altered the density of the forest to favor food-producing trees without destroying the complex underbrush that supported the deer and boar they also relied upon.
I am fascinated by the psychological framing of this. It's essentially ancient guerrilla gardening.
That's a great comparison.
Like, imagine the mindset required to plant a fruit-bearing tree in the middle of a wild forest, knowing that you don't hold a deed to that land, you don't own the tree, and animals might literally eat the fruit before you do. You're not building a private farm. You're enriching a shared wild environment for the collective benefit of the entire ecosystem.
It requires what we might call a hawk's eye view of nature. To manage a diet of 350 types of shellfish and 55 types of plants across seasons requires a staggering database of empirical knowledge.
You have to know everything about everything.
You do. You need to know precisely when a specific nut falls, how a slight temperature shift affects a fish migration, and how altering one part of the forest impacts the game animals.
And this wasn't just passive observation either. It was high-level applied science. The vlog breaks down their method for processing horse chestnuts, which is incredible. Apparently, raw horse chestnuts are packed with a compound called saponin.
Saponins are a fascinating biological defense mechanism. They are essentially highly toxic, bitter compounds designed to punish any animal that tries to eat the seed.
Right. Nature's way of saying, do not eat this.
Exactly. If you ingest raw horse chestnuts, the saponins will cause severe gastrointestinal distress, and they can't simply be washed away by rinsing them in a stream.
But the Jomon cracked the chemical code to neutralize them. They didn't have periodic tables or modern laboratories. They figured out that by taking specific types of wood ash, burning it, and dissolving it in water, they created an alkaline liquid.
They essentially manufactured potassium hydroxide.
Which is crazy.
It is. When you steep the crushed chestnuts in this specific alkaline lye, the base-catalyzed hydrolysis breaks down the chemical bonds of the saponins, allowing the toxins to be safely leached out.
That is multi-step chemical extraction. They discovered this through intense observation, trial and error, and then codified it into a sacred survival technique passed down through generations.
It's a massive technological achievement.
And once they had this detoxified chestnut and acorn flour, they went a step further and created what the sources refer to as Jomon cookies.
The culinary engineering here is remarkable.
They would take this complex flour, mix it with animal fats, perhaps marrow, maybe incorporate some ground meat or wild bird eggs, and bake it over an open hearth.
Like an ancient protein bar.
Yes. Here's where it gets really interesting. When modern scientists ran a nutritional analysis on the remnants of these baked goods, they found they yielded roughly 400 to 500 kilocalories per 100 grams.
It's a phenomenal ratio of weight to energy.
It's identical to the macronutrient profile of a modern, lab-engineered survival protein bar. I go to the gym and buy these foil-wrapped bars designed by sports scientists, and the Jomon were baking the exact same optimized energy source over a fire thousands of years ago to ensure they could survive harsh winters without needing to hoard grain.
They engineered a dense, portable food source perfectly adapted to their environment, and their chemical expertise wasn't limited to survival rations either. The sources reveal a deep engagement with complex fermentation.
Oh, right, the Jomon wine. The archaeological evidence dates it back 6,000 years.
They were producing fruit wine, utilizing wild mountain grapes. The specific evidence for this is a unique type of pottery discovered at a site near Yatsugatake in Nagano Prefecture.
The presentation slide deck highlights this specific pot, and its design is incredibly deliberate. It features exactly 18 small, perfectly spaced holes pierced completely around the rim.
Archaeologists and fermentation specialists examine this vessel and realize the holes serve a highly specific mechanical function.
It's not just decoration.
Not at all.
Mm-hmm.
The fermentation process relies on yeast consuming sugars to produce alcohol, but a major byproduct of that chemical reaction is the rapid expansion of carbon dioxide gas.
Right.
If you seal fermenting grapes inside a solid clay pot, the pressure will build until the pot literally explodes like a bomb.
So those 18 holes are an ancient engineered pressure release valve. The CO2 escapes, the alcohol remains.
Precisely. It is purpose-built technology for creating psychoactive substances. And crucially, they maintained their philosophy. They weren't domesticating the grapes in massive vineyards. They were harvesting wild mountain grapes and relying entirely on the ambient, wild yeast present on the skins of the fruit.
Just utilizing the natural world without attempting to dominate it.
Exactly.
So if I'm understanding this, we have a society with impenetrable food security, sophisticated applied chemistry, and a completely integrated relationship with their environment. But here is the inherent danger of a localized circular economy. If one village had a great harvest of chestnuts and a neighboring village starves, human nature usually dictates that the starving village will attack.
Resource conflict, yes.
Right. To survive 13,000 years, they couldn't just engineer food. They had to engineer a social fabric that made warfare and hoarding economically impossible.
That is the exact transition point where their ecological philosophy becomes a socio-economic reality. The sources outline what they call the Jomon Grand Design for Peace, anchored by 4 fundamental principles, the 4 things not to do.
It reads like a minimalist manifesto, but it sustained a civilization longer than any modern political ideology. Let's walk through these. Rule number 1, do not own.
The foundational belief that everything, the land, the water, the animals, the trees, and the people themselves, is essentially borrowed from the natural cycle. You cannot assert permanent private ownership over the earth.
Which naturally feeds into rule number 2, do not accumulate. If you don't own the land, you have no right to hoard its output.
It's a biological failsafe, really. Because their primary food sources, fish, nuts, berries, would eventually rot if stored too long, The environment itself physically prevented them from hoarding massive generational wealth.
That's super practical.
It is, but it was also a strict social mechanism. By culturally outlawing accumulation, they prevent the rise of monopolies. Without monopolies of resources, coercive, powerful leaders cannot emerge to subjugate the population.
Rule number 3 is where they completely diverge from the rest of human history. Do not expand.
Instead of following the standard model, where a successful village grows into a sprawling town, the town consumes more resources to become a city, and the city militarizes into an empire. The Jomon practiced extreme demographic self-regulation.
The sources say a typical village hit its natural carrying capacity at around 30 to 50 people. Once they reached that limit, instead of expanding their borders and consuming more of the local forest, they underwent a process the vlog calls cell division.
It is a perfect biological metaphor. The community would peacefully bifurcate. A portion of the group would pack up, move a sustainable distance away, and establish a new small village.
Just splitting to keep things balanced.
Right. This ensured that human population density never overwhelmed the regenerative capacity of any single microbiome.
But if you constantly split your communities and spread out across a jagged, mountainous island chain, the risk of total isolation is massive, which makes rule number 4 vital: do not disconnect.
Despite the physical distance, they maintained an incredibly dense, interconnected network spanning the entire archipelago.
Our sources refer to the system that powered this network as trust capitalism. And we should clarify how that term is being used here. The authors are applying a modern economic lens to analyze an ancient structure, looking at how value was exchanged without currency.
Right, it's an analytical tool.
Yeah, we're exploring the mechanics of this system as outlined in the text, impartially presenting it without endorsing or critiquing modern economic systems. But the mechanics are just staggering. It is a continent-spanning economy operating with absolutely no money, no central state authority, and no military force to enforce contracts.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, in a society where physical wealth cannot be hoarded, you must find an alternative mechanism to secure your future against famine or disaster.
You have to invest in something else.
Exactly. The Jomon engineered a society where the only lasting asset you could accumulate, the ultimate currency, was trust.
The social fabric itself was the economy. The vlog gives this brilliant example of the jade trade. They were mining high-quality jade in Itoigawa on the mainland. They were mining obsidian in Hokkaido in the far north. And these materials were being transported and traded as far south as the islands of Okinawa.
We are talking about luxury goods moving across hundreds of miles of treacherous ocean and rugged, mountainous terrain.
And it required a highly specialized division of labor. You had artisans making the beads, hunters providing the food, navigators transporting the goods. Think about how a modern economy works.
Very differently, that's for sure.
Right.
The system functioned flawlessly because the penalty for breaking that trust was social excommunication, which in a survival environment equates to death.
Wow, so the stakes were incredibly high.
Absolutely. If a transporter stole the jade, the information would propagate through the network. The next time that transporter's isolated village of 30 people suffered a bad winter and needed emergency food rations, the neighboring villages would refuse to help.
Because they broke the trust.
Yes, the entire archipelago was bound together by profound, inescapable, life-or-death reciprocity.
It is a completely different neurological framework for human survival. It's decentralized, relying on the weight of social consequence rather than the threat of a standing army. And because this structure freed them from the endless, exhausting paranoia of wealth protection and wars of territorial expansion, they suddenly had an immense surplus of time and intellectual energy.
They didn't have to spend years laboring to build massive defensive walls around their villages. They didn't have to conscript their young people into standing armies to fight over borders.
So what do you do with that freed-up human potential? You turn your eyes upward to the cosmos and inward to the profound mysteries of the cycle of life. The way the Jomon approached astronomy and spirituality it forces a total reevaluation of what we consider advanced technology.
Let's examine the Sanai Maruyama site in Aomori Prefecture, which provides a stunning window into their architectural and astronomical capabilities.
According to the sources, this single settlement was continuously occupied for 1,700 years. That number is difficult to process. 1,700 years.
It's an immense stretch of time.
That is vastly longer than the entire lifespan of the Roman Empire. It is longer than most modern nation-states have existed. And they lived on the exact same plot of land without exhausting the soil or the local biome for nearly 2 millennia.
The centerpiece of Santa Mariama is a massive architectural structure supported by giant chestnut pillars. Archaeological analysis reveals these pillars were spaced exactly 4.2 meters apart.
Showing they had math.
Exactly. This indicates they had developed a standardized unit of measurement applied consistently across large-scale construction. Furthermore, the alignment of these pillars was mathematically precise, oriented to align perfectly with the solstices.
It functioned as a massive astronomical clock. But even more mind-bending is the Kaneyama megalithic site in Gifu Prefecture. The vlog describes this as a complex solar observatory.
It is a cluster of massive, incredibly heavy megalithic stones intentionally arranged with astonishing precision. Sunlight travels through specific gaps in the stones to hit carved markers on the interior faces.
But it only hits those marks at the exact moments of the solstices and equinoxes, right?
Yes. It is a 5,000-year-old analog machine with 0 moving parts, and it still functions flawlessly today.
But here's where my brain just short-circuits. The sources state that researchers studying the alignments believe this stone observatory wasn't just tracking the basic 4 seasons. It was sophisticated enough to account for a 128-year leap year correction cycle.
This raises an important question about how we define data storage and the transmission of knowledge.
I am really struggling to wrap my head around the mechanics of this. A tropical year is roughly 365.24 days. If you don't have a written language to write down fractional math or astronomical tables, how does a society even realize that their seasonal calendar has drifted by a single day?
It requires deep, sustained attention.
And more importantly, how do you pass down a data set tracking that microdrift over 128 years without a single written record?
Today, we rely on microchips and server farms to maintain our collective memory. The Jomon encoded their data directly into their culture. To track a 128-year variance, a single human lifespan is completely insufficient. You need an unbroken chain of observation lasting at least 4 or 5 generations.
So you have, like, a grandfather pointing to a shadow on a stone, telling his granddaughter, when I was a boy, the sun touched this specific notch. Watch where it touches for you.
Exactly that kind of interaction.
And she has to memorize that exact spatial relationship, hold it in her mind for 50 years, and relay it with absolute flawless fidelity to her own grandson.
They embedded mathematical and astronomical data into their songs, their oral mythologies, and their rituals. They sustained this observational chain for centuries until they possessed the precise data required to physically move massive megaliths into an alignment that reflects that deep cosmic rhythm.
And to echo UNESCO's earlier point, they didn't build this incredibly precise, multi-generational observatory so a king could stand in the center and proclaim, "Behold my magic clock, I command the sun."
Exactly the opposite. It was a utilitarian communal tool. It was built by the collective for the collective to ensure that their foraging patterns, their semi-cultivation, and their spiritual rituals remain perfectly synchronized with the macro rhythms of nature.
Which flows seamlessly into their spiritual worldview, animism.
Animism is the fundamental belief that nature itself is the divine. There is no singular anthropomorphic deity sitting in the clouds judging humanity from above.
It's all around you.
Right. The divine is the mountain, the river, the bear, the ancient tree. Every element of the ecosystem possesses a spirit, and humanity is merely one participating spirit among many.
This egalitarian spiritual view deeply affected how they lived, but the sources show it had a shockingly beautiful impact on how they processed death. In many later Japanese periods and in the vast majority of modern cultures, death is treated as something impure, a source of biological and spiritual contamination.
This is a very common human reaction to push it away.
Yeah, we push our graveyards to the far outskirts of town. We hide death behind high walls.
The Jomon embraced death as an essential, necessary phase of the cycle. Archaeological excavations reveal that their graves were not hidden on the periphery. They were located right in the dead center of the village plaza.
You would literally walk past or even over the remains of your ancestors every single time you left your house to forage or gather water.
Because in an animistic, circular worldview, the dead haven't vanished. They haven't departed to a distant heaven. They have simply returned to the biological and spiritual cycle of the local ecosystem. Their energy remains intimately woven into the daily fabric of the community.
The most heartbreaking, yet profoundly comforting example of this worldview from the sources is their practice surrounding deceased infants. Infant mortality was tragically high in the ancient world. But when a Jomon baby died, they didn't just dig a hole in the ground. They utilized a highly specific burial practice involving pottery.
They would place the infant's remains inside a specialized hollow clay pot, which archaeologists widely interpret as a symbolic representation of a womb.
They would take this womb pot and bury it directly beneath or near the entrance of the family dwelling. The interpretation here is astonishingly beautiful. As the grieving mother walked over the threshold of her home day after day, the belief was that her physical proximity, the energetic connection between mother and child, would encourage the infant soul to leave the clay vessel and return to her physical womb so the child could be reborn into the world.
It completely reframes the psychology of grief. It transforms a final, devastating ending into a temporary pause within an eternal cycle.
And maintaining the psychological health of the community, keeping that cycle turning, was the primary role of the shamans.
The shamans were the spiritual engineers of the society, and it is highly notable in the archaeological record that these figures were predominantly women.
The vlog details excavations of female shamans buried with immense reverence, their graves heavily covered in red ochre, a pigment deeply sacred to the Jomon, likely symbolizing blood, birth, and vitality.
In a society obsessively focused on the cyclical nature of life, birth, the changing of the seasons, and lunar phases, it aligns perfectly that the feminine principle was elevated as the primary conduit to the divine.
That makes perfect sense.
These female shamans were responsible for leading what are known as matsuri, or communal festivals.
But these weren't just parties. There was a critical psychological necessity to the matsuri. The sources introduce a concept called kegarai, which roughly translates to a withered, stagnant, or depleted spirit.
Think of it as the ancient equivalent of severe communal burnout. When a community spends months enduring a harsh winter, cooperating endlessly to survive, the collective psychological energy of the group becomes drained. Social frictions build up. The spirit withers.
To cure this kegar, the shaman would initiate a matsuri to restore hair, which represents vitality, bright energy, the return of the sunshine.
The matsuri was a highly engineered social release valve. Under the guidance of the shaman, the community would consume the Jomon wine, eat the high-calorie Jomon cookies, engage in rhythmic dancing, and enter a state of collective trance.
They were essentially rebooting their communal nervous system. They used the ritual to dissolve interpersonal tensions and reaffirm their profound, inescapable connection to one another and to the force that sustained them.
It was a vital maintenance mechanism. You simply cannot sustain a peaceful, localized society for 13,000 years without an incredibly robust, culturally ingrained system for processing trauma, managing psychological stress, and reinforcing social cohesion.
Okay, so they achieved this staggering 13,000-year unbroken run of peace and sustainability. But eventually the era does end. Climate shifts occur, mass rice agriculture is heavily introduced by a massive influx of migrants from the Asian continent, the Yayoi period begins, and the society fundamentally changes.
Yes, the standard path eventually arrives.
We get the iron tools, the rice paddies, and eventually the warlords. But the most powerful argument in these sources is that the Jomon didn't actually vanish. The physical artifacts were buried, but the DNA of their worldview is still quietly running like a background operating system in modern life.
This is where the archaeology transitions from a study of the past into a deeply personal reflection on the present, particularly within Japanese culture, but extending to anyone seeking an alternative paradigm for living.
Let's go back to that 6,000-year-old Jomon wine ritual. The practice of fermenting the mountain grapes, offering the first portion to the unseen spirits of the forest, and then sharing the remainder collectively among the villagers. The vlog argues this is the absolute genesis of a core spiritual concept called Shinjin Kyoshoku,
which translates to the act of unifying with the divine by sharing a meal.
It's a completely different approach to worship. You aren't bowing down in terror to a distant, wrathful god. You are pulling up a chair and sharing a drink with the divine forces of nature. And the astonishing thing is, this exact architectural framework for ritual survives intact today.
It's remarkably persistent.
When you visit a modern Shinto shrine in Japan, you might receive omiki sacred sake offered to the kami, the spirits.
It is the exact same mechanism. Or consider the traditional Japanese wedding ceremony, the Sansan Kudo, where the profound bond of marriage is cemented not by signing a legal contract, but by the bride and groom ritually sharing cups of sake.
Even the most sacred hidden ritual of the Japanese imperial family, the Ninamsai, centers entirely on the emperor offering the first harvest of the new grain to the gods, and then consuming it with them in the dark of night.
The specific physical components have evolved. They swapped wild mountain grapes for cultivated rice wine. But the spiritual architecture, the foundational belief that communal sharing of sustenance bridges the gap between humanity and the divine, is an unbroken 6,000-year-old thread tying modern society directly back to those 18-hole clay pots.
It's honestly breathtaking when you trace that lineage. And this survival isn't limited to rare spiritual rituals. It is baked right into the daily vocabulary. The sources highlight two incredibly famous Japanese words that have recently gained massive global traction: itadakimasu and matanai.
These concepts are frequently translated for foreign audiences, but often without their deep ancestral context.
Itadakimasu is the phrase spoken before beginning any meal in Japan. It is usually politely translated as "I humbly receive," but the vlog dives deeper into the etymology and the spirit of the word. It is a profound, solemn expression of reverence for the act of taking a life.
A very literal acknowledgement of sacrifice.
Right. Whether it is a fish, a deer, or a stalk of rice, you are acknowledging that a life was extinguished to sustain your own. It is the linguistic echo, ringing across thousands of years, of the Jomon hunter thanking the forest for the deer.
And matanai functions as the moral and aesthetic compass for how to treat that life once it is taken. It is the deep sense of regret or sorrow when something of value is wasted. It is the direct philosophical descendant of the Jomon imperative to use everything up.
To waste a piece of food or to throw away a usable tool is not just economically foolish, it is a spiritual violation. It breaks the sacred, circular chain of life that the Jomon fought so intensely to maintain.
If we synthesize the vast array of data from these diverse sources, the archaeological slides, the anthropological vlog, Levi-Strauss's artistic analysis, they are all converging on a singular monumental conclusion.
That the Jomon weren't just a footnote.
Exactly. The Jomon period cannot be dismissed as a primitive precursor to real civilization. It is, in many respects, humanity's masterpiece of sustainable design.
A 13,000-year masterpiece of peace. When you hear a word like matanai, or when you stand in the quiet shade of an old-growth forest and feel your nervous system suddenly decompress, the sources suggest that feeling isn't an accident. That is the 13,000-year-old DNA of the Jomon asserting itself, offering a quiet rebellion against the relentless burnout and extraction of the modern world.
It serves as absolute empirical proof that the way we operate our global society today, the hyper-competitive, endlessly expanding extractive model, is not the only way human beings are capable of living. We possess the innate, proven capacity for profound ecological and social balance.
So what does this all mean? It proves that we are perfectly capable of living in a state of enough. The constant grinding pressure for more, bigger, faster is a choice we make, not a biological mandate we have to follow.
Which is an incredibly empowering and hopeful realization to extract from the archaeological dirt.
It truly is. Okay, we have covered massive ground today, so let's pull all these threads together. We started by looking at avant-garde, asymmetrical pottery that top global intellectuals realize rivals modern art. We explored a highly advanced people who had the boats, the chemical knowledge, and the resources to build a conquering empire.
But they intentionally looked at the standard path of wealth accumulation and warfare and consciously walked the other way.
Right. We analyzed the intricate mechanics of their circular economy, from engineering 500-calorie survival cookies to carefully leaving immature shellfish behind. They ensured their biome thrived alongside them.
We marveled at an economic system of trust capitalism that facilitated the trade of luxury jade across hundreds of miles of ocean without a single coin or soldier.
We examined a 5,000-year-old analog solar calendar that tracked a 128-year orbital drift using nothing but stones, shadows, and flawless multi-generational oral transmission.
And finally, we uncovered how their animistic worldview, their profound reverence for the interconnected cycle of life and death, survives vibrantly today in daily language and sacred rituals.
I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought built entirely on the staggering reality these sources have presented to us. The Jomon people looked at the world, recognized that the standard path of endless growth and the hoarding of surplus would inevitably lead to violence and ruin, and they intentionally stepped off that treadmill. In doing so, they secured 13,000 years of unbroken peace for their descendants.
A legacy we can learn from today.
I want you to examine your own life, or our broader modern society today. Think back to the beginning of our deep dive, to that historical map with the jagged red line of an empire expanding endlessly until it collapses under its own weight. We are still drawing those lines today. We just use corporate growth charts, relentless 40-hour work weeks, and the endless accumulation of digital and physical stuff. We are obsessed with constant economic expansion at all costs.
It is the modern standard path.
So what standard path in your own life might you need to consciously, intentionally reject? What endless pursuit of more do you need to step away from in order to find your own 10,000 years of peace?
It is a profound challenge and the perfect lens through which to view our own choices moving forward.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope it sparked a fire in your mind. Keep questioning the paths laid out before you, and we will catch you next time.